Everyone. I welcome you all to ET Energy World webinar. To present this webinar, I welcome Mr. OP Agarwal, CEO, WRI, and Mr. Bhagirath Jairaj, Director, Energy Program, WRI, on the topic Post COP23 Way Forward for Energy and Transport Sector. There will be a presentation on the topic, followed by a question and answer session wherein you may submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Now I request Mr. OP Agarwal and Mr. Bhagirath Jairaj to start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me make a beginning by thanking you for this opportunity. We have two components to this presentation, essentially a way forward for the transport sector and the energy sector. I will initially talk about the transport sector and then pass it on to my colleague Bharat to talk about the energy sector. But starting first with COP, the Conference of Parties, 23rd Conference of Parties, which was held recently in Bonn, was really the first one that took place after the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement. The developing countries really appealed for accelerated climate action, primarily to ensure that the commitments that have already been made are duly honored. There was, emphasis on delivering on past pledges, both for emissions reductions as well as for mobilization of the finance that had been committed. There was a very strong emphasis on urban areas. Cities and regions were a very important part of the discussions, and several urban leaders and policymakers from around the world were in participation. Many of them from the US, really highlighting the fact that the US was committed to climate action, even though national governments were pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Now, future directions for urban mobility really were focused on connected systems, not standalone systems, and again, a very strong emphasis on electric mobility as a sustainable fuel. So these are the kind of conversations that were taking place on how climate action could be taken to the streets. There were a number of key players who were involved at the COP23, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Eco-Mobility Alliance, and an organization called the Transforming Urban Mobility Initiative from the German government. All of them were very important players there. And the key message that kept coming out from all the discussions that took place were about sustainable transport, were about integrated and comprehensive transport solutions, and about sustainable fuels, the three major things that came out of this whole thing. Well, while we were in Bonn, this is what we had in Delhi. The kind of air pollution levels which had never been seen before is what we were suffering in Delhi. And this is really where the call for action really took place as to what we need to be doing in this space. So let me move on from this to what's happening in the transport space and what really needs to happen in the transport space. The key problem, way forward, the key problem that we face in transport is first looking at why is it important? What is the role of transport? Now, this transport connects people to jobs, to education. People come to cities to look for jobs, to look for employment. And transport systems connect them to that employment, connects them to education, connects them to healthcare. Now, without transport, these kind of connections will not be possible. Secondly, it connects goods to markets. So where goods are produced to where they are consumed, that connection happens through the transport system. And often people say that cities are the engines of economic growth. And if that be the case, then the transport system provides the wheels of that engine. Another analogy that is often given is of the transport system being like the circulatory system in the human body. Blood transports nutrients from where they are absorbed to where they are needed. And if this kind of a blood flow stops in a human body, a person is dead. Similarly, if a transport system in a city stops moving, the city would also be dead. So these are important analogies to keep in mind as to why the transport system becomes very important. Now, the transport network also provides a framework for how a city grows. Typically, it's like a human body. You have a skeleton, and the body is placed around that skeleton so that there is a formal shape to that body. Similarly, the transport system provides that framework around which a body grows. Now, this slide really shows you what is the problem we have been facing on transport. There has been a very rapid, in fact, an explosive growth of registered motor vehicles in the country. From something like 5.4 million vehicles in 1981, it's gone up to 210 million vehicles in 2015. And our population during this period has grown by about 77%, but the number of motor vehicles has grown by 2,500%. This is an indication of how rapidly our motor vehicle growth has taken place, and this is really what has led to the kind of congestion that we see in most cities around the country. Now, why is this rapid motorization taking place? There are a number of reasons for this. As more people move into cities, cities have grown in size, and it also meant that travel distances have gone up. So longer travel distances also necessitates motorized travel. Similarly, incomes have gone up. And incomes have gone up not only means that people make more trips, but they want to demonstrate the higher income status by owning a personal motor vehicle. So that again has been a motivation for increase in the number of motor vehicles. At the same time, public transport has not really provided the kind of quality and the capacity that is needed. It has not kept pace with the growing demand. So poor public transport has also forced people to go in for their personal motor vehicles. Walking and cycling are not very safe anymore because the space that was available for walking and cycling has often been taken away for cars. Now, all of these have led to some kind of a preference for personal motor vehicles, for longer trip lengths, and a higher number of trips. And I would say that these are the number of factors that have contributed to rapid motorization. Now, it's not just about congestion. What has rapid motorization led to? Over 150,000 people are killed in road accidents in India almost every year. 2016, this was roughly the number. It's been growing from year to year, and the kind of social damage that is done, the social cost of people killed in road accidents has been huge for the families who have got affected. Air pollution levels in most cities in India exceed the WHO standards. And we've seen a picture earlier of what the air pollution levels were like. Now, this again is partly contributed by the rapid motorization. Growth of oil consumption. This is how oil consumption in India has been growing from year to year. And it is really a measure of the energy security that we are talking about, because most of this oil is today imported, and imported from countries where prices are vulnerable to shocks on political considerations rather than economic considerations. So this is a threat to our energy security and something that we need to think about going forward. So what do we need? That's the background to the problems we are facing. What we seem to need is really meeting the growing travel demand with lower vehicle kilometers. Can we meet people's travel needs, which are growing, but with a shorter vehicle kilometer use? Essentially, what this means is it's achieving more with less. And to my mind, that is smart mobility. Now, how can you do that? One is a vastly improved public transport system. Not the kind of public transport system we had in place earlier, which primarily catered to people who could afford nothing else. Today, we are in a situation where we want public transport that is attractive enough to people who can even afford personal motor vehicles. So it means a vast improvement in its quality. We need safer infrastructure for cycling and walking. And the picture on the right really shows you what safe infrastructure for walking and cycling can look like. We are also looking at shorter travel distances. Now, if cities are sprawling, it doesn't mean that everyone needs to travel long distances. We can start designing cities that are more compact and with what is called mixed-use planning. That means residential areas, working areas don't have to be at opposite ends of the city. They can be intertwined, they can be interlinked, so that the average travel distances can come down. And often short travel distances mean that walking and cycling are usually enough. We can have attractive buses. So far, our image of the bus was it's only something that no one else will want to travel in, or someone who can't afford anything else would want to travel in. But then globally, you have much better buses. And here's one picture. Here's yet another picture of buses that have been operating in cities around the world. And there's no reason why our buses also cannot start becoming more attractive. Safer cycling and walking. These are again some pictures from around the world on what safe walking and cycling environment can mean. There's Broadway in New York, Utrecht in Netherlands, Oxford Street in Singapore. These are very rich areas. Yet, if you look at these pictures, the kind of environment they have provided for people to walk and cycle and enjoy themselves is really something to be emulated. In India, a wave of something called Rahagiri, an initiative which WRI was part of initiating, has taken place in many cities, where the whole idea is that a street is used primarily for having fun, and cycling and walking are becoming popular as a result of that. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention, most cities around the country, about 50 odd cities in India, are thinking of building metro rail systems. Quite a few have already got operational metro rail systems. But what this slide is showing you is that if the captive area of a metro system is only about half a kilometer around the metro line, then in Bangalore, only about 8% of the population comes within the captive area. If we increase that to about 3 kilometers, then the captive population is about 45% of the population. And if we are able to increase that to about 5 kilometers, then the captive population becomes 73% of the city population. What this is arguing is that a metro line by itself is not good enough. You need to connect the metro to other forms of transport, interlink them very closely so that the captive area of the metro system goes up and more people use the metro. So this is really a case for integrated systems that meet door-to-door travel needs. Now, what this needs is a comprehensive deployment of several measures in a well-planned manner. So you have transit-oriented development whereby you create densities close to metro stations. You have feeder bus systems which are well connected with the metro system so that people can transfer from buses to the metro system seamlessly and without hassles of having to buy another ticket or transferring long distances or waiting too long. So this is what would provide for a good integrated system, which would be able to attract people away from their personal motor vehicles. Now, some of the trends, at this point, it's good to mention some of the trends that we see emerging not only in India but around the world. We are moving from a situation where we had only limited travel options to a much wider variety of travel options. I remember when I was a student, it was either you take a bus or you take your own motorbike or you take a car. There was really nothing else. Later on, metro systems have come up of a few cities around the country. But today, if you look at the options available, it's massive. You not only have the auto rickshaws and the taxis, but you also have the Ubers, you have the shared vehicles, you have Uber pools, you have shuttle minibuses, you have a whole range of options. Now, this multiplicity of options, the good thing about it is it's helping to meet varying demands. There are people who cannot afford to pay as much for a taxi, so the Uber pool is an option for them. There are people who cannot pay enough even for an Uber pool, so the aggregated shuttle buses are an option. There are people who are able to pay much more, so they are able to take their own cars. So the variety of options is this big thing that is happening around the world. The concept that is now emerging also is it's not necessary to own a car. It's enough if you can own a ride. So if you can use a car for a temporary period just to meet your ride, that is the trend that is coming up in the form of shared mobility. So from owning a car to owning a ride. The other big thing that's happening is the move from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. And that is a very rapidly growing trend. The other thing that is coming up is from supply management, we're moving towards demand management. Now, what this means is earlier when the number of vehicles used to grow up on the roads, the tendency was to widen the road or to build flyovers. Today, the concept is changing to one of how do we try to reduce the demand for transport? And the demand for transport reductions are happening by way of greater emphasis on public transport so that fewer vehicles can meet larger travel needs. It's also happening by way of trying to push for shorter trip lengths so that vehicles don't have to travel so far to meet people's travel need. So countries like Singapore and others have imposed very strong restrictions on even the ownership of motor vehicles. Again, a measure of demand management. London has started charging a congestion fee for getting into central parts of the city. Again, a measure of demand management. So the focus is moving from managing supply to managing demand. Then this whole idea of not just looking at a corridor for providing good public transport, but looking at an area-wide approach. So just building a metro on one corridor is not enough. You look at providing services across a wider area with connected systems. And then moving from independent systems to connected systems. So it's not everyone traveling in isolation, but a much wider connected system which gives you information on traffic conditions across the cities, traffic conditions on the road ahead, alternative roads that you can take. That's part of the connected systems value. Well, looking at the future from all this, it seems to me that the future is really directed at shared vehicles, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. This is what will lead to the future of mobility, but the success of this really depends on how effectively we are able to bring in renewable energy into our energy systems so that we are not stuck with having to depend on coal to provide the electricity that we need. That is not what climate action would really require. But what's happening on our renewable energy front, I'll leave it for my colleague Bharat to explain that.
Great, thank you, OP. Let me start by just picking up from that that point. Now, as we know, a part of India's climate commitments is the national determined commitments, the NDCs. One of that is that India will achieve 40% of its total capacity from non-fossil fuels by 2030. That's a very ambitious target, for any country, let alone a country that has been so dependent on fossil fuels for its growth. So now what we have actually, unlike some of the other numbers and which are derived in the NDC context, the 40% renewable energy, 40% non-fossil fuel target actually comes with an interim milestone, and that is the 2022 target that the Indian government has taken on, by which time we have to install 175 gigawatts of renewable energy. So this is an extremely important sort of interim milestone. It will tell us in 2022 how close we are to getting towards that NDC and what corrections we would need to make. Now, it is going to be significantly different. It's going to be a new system almost. We've developed our entire electricity system based on our understanding of how fossil fuels work, which have large economies of scale. So they tend to be large power plants that then connect with transmission systems and then go to distribution centers, and then from there come to your homes, to your shops, to your factories, and so on. So it was a one-way system that sent you electricity in one direction, and then revenue flowed back in the other system, in the opposite direction. Now, when we think about renewable energy, particularly the nature of this technology with solar and wind and small hydro and biomass and so on, these are not necessarily fixed in, there's no sort of economies of scale. In fact, they actually work the reverse. They're best used and consumed where they're generated. So the entire system sort of changes, stands on its head almost. And so almost like the transport sector, where you heard OP just talk about, from a sort of one-way system, this is now a network system. Anyone can be a generator of electricity today. And so it completely requires a rethinking, a shift of mindsets. And it changes the way we plan, because we used to plan for a fixed, in the sort of good old days, all we did was we looked at what our GDP was, what the electricity need for that was, then we just worked out some number that said, okay, we're growing at 8% or 7%, and then we said our electricity is going to need to grow by that same number. Today, and so it was a very supply-focused effort, and again, like OP said, the trend is that you have to move now towards understanding demand, who needs it, who doesn't have it, how do you actually meet that demand. This slide, and that was a background, but this slide actually tells you that over the last 5 years, renewable energy has been growing really rapidly. So I'm not only talking about, these isolated rooftop solar in some friend's house or some village somewhere. We're talking about serious growth of renewable energy happening year on year at 20%. And a significant part of it continues to be in wind, but solar is where the government has put a very large target, and that's also seeing significant growth. Now, I also want to make this point that it's, with renewable energy, it will disproportionately impact different states, because again, renewable energy's growth will depend on which state has that particular renewable energy source. And in those states, it can be a significant part of meeting the demand. So in states like Tamil Nadu and Rajasthan, almost a quarter of the load during peak was met by renewable energy in 2016. Now this is so it's not us. I just want to make the point that we're not talking about something that's going to happen in the future, something that's going to happen 5-10 years from now. This has already happened last year. And of course, this comes with, you can see the second bullet says these states will also face high curtailment risk. And that is that our systems, our planning systems and so on, continue to largely depend on our understanding of how fossil fuels have worked. So when you don't know what to do with your thermal power plants, what you don't want to do is run into a situation where thermal power plants will become stranded assets, that you can't use those anymore. So what has happened is, and this is a trend that's going back and forth, but some of these states are asking renewable energy plants to back down. We've seen this happening in Tamil Nadu, we've seen this happening in Rajasthan, some other states as well. Renewable energy are being asked to back down. Some states, they're asking renewable energy to run and must run and so on. So the sort of 2 points here. One is that renewable energy is here to stay. It's growing rapidly, and it is going to continue to grow because of the target set by the government. But that the second point is that our systems are still playing catch up. And by systems, I mean planning systems, our technical systems, our financial sort of modeling systems, and so on and so forth. You can see in the numbers here that the targets that we've set, 60 gigawatts of wind by 2022, 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022, we're sort of just starting off, at least as far as solar is concerned. Wind, we had a significant growth. Much of it, again, is been in states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. But you will see that for solar in 2017, we're just about the 13, 14 gigawatts target, a number. And so we have significant amount of ground to cover in the next 5 years if we have to achieve the target. And one of the key routes that has been used is been by commercial and industrial consumers through what is called the open access route. Let me just give you a bit of context here. Commercial and industrial consumers. As you might know, the Indian consumer sort of categories are industrial, commercial, agricultural, and residential. Of course, there are various subcategories and so on. But at a macro level, commercial and industrial consumers consume 52% of India's electricity. And now the cross-subsidy regime that we've been practicing in the country charges them a slightly higher rate so that they can essentially cross-subsidize those who at the lower end of consumption, typically smaller domestic consumers and agriculture. So open access, now the Electricity Act in 2003 provided policy direction by sort of one was of course encouraging renewables, but the other was also allowing open access. And open access is where these commercial and industrial consumers can procure renewable energy and other power directly from a third party, but use the electrical sort of cables of the utility and pay a charge for it. And now this has been a key route that has sort of unlocked investments towards achieving significant renewable energy capacity. This has been encouraged. As we know, Karnataka regulator some years ago made this access of open access fees, brought it down to zero, saying if you're obtaining renewable energy through this route, then we want to encourage you to do so because you're meeting your demand on your own and reducing the deficit in the state by actually paying for your own and generating your own electricity. So open access has been a sort of key route and has contributed in a non-trivial manner in achieving some of this renewable energy capacity. But there's this other side of open access, and I'm using this as an example to say that it's one thing to talk about 40% of our capacity will be non-fossil fuel, to have an interim milestone of 175 gigawatts of renewables, but then to actually get it operational and implemented on the ground, there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done. And we are still figuring out many of these steps. And so open access, which was seen as this fabulous way by which commercial industrial consumers were able to get their own power and use this, is now seeing a backlash. And this is because, as I said again, this is a transition and we need to think through this transition carefully. Today, short-term open access represents almost 10% of industrial consumption. And so what's happened, therefore, is utilities are losing out on their key higher-paying customers. Higher-paying because, remember, I said already that they are charged a higher fee because of the cross-subsidy regime. So you're losing your higher-paying customers, and it means that you are no longer going to be able to provide the same level and quality and quantity of electricity to the subsidized consumers because you're losing that key revenue. It also impacts long-term planning and finances of the utilities, because the thing with short-term open access is that as a company, I might have, say, contracted with a third party to procure, say, wind energy for over a 6-month period. But then if on some day that company cannot send me that wind energy, I will just turn back to the utility and say, okay, listen, you have to provide this for me. So in terms of planning, the utility still needs to keep you on as a consumer, and it has no idea how much you're going to consume at what point and so on. So these are sort of genuine questions, genuine concerns that need to be addressed. And so what utilities have been doing increasingly, and I've just listed in this slide 5 states that have begun to increase their open access charges, the additional surcharges for open access as of 2017, and these range from sort of half a paise to 1 rupee or a little more than a rupee, but that can actually alter the economic incentives for companies going down this route. So what we are seeing then is also that that companies who had, for instance, gone down the open access route are now rethinking the sort of PPAs that they have signed with these third parties, and this sort of this notion of sort of taking one step forward, two steps back, and not knowing sort of in terms of clarity what direction we should go doesn't actually help anyone. I'll give you another example. As we all know, you've been following the newspaper sort of headlines about rapidly falling renewable energy tariffs, and it's just a lot of the skeptics feel it's gone too low. The companies will never be able to provide at that power and at that cost and so on. But what you're also seeing is state utilities that have signed PPAs with some of these companies are now wanting to renegotiate based on these lower rates. Now, this again has its impact on investor confidence, and pretty much every state you can think of, or at least most of these states have tried to renegotiate renewable energy PPAs, just taking the cost, the lowest, the reverse auction sort of cost that they've arrived at, and it makes it again very difficult to then predict from a policy perspective, figure out which direction are we headed, and what do we need to do. So these sort of this was just to give you sort of one example of how the transition to clean energy, which is going to be a key part to how India is going to achieve its climate commitments, that it isn't only about setting targets, and it isn't only about setting up implementing agencies, but actually thinking through what this might involve, what it might involve at down to the level of the consumers. And WRI has been for the last few years working with the Confederation of Indian Industries and trying to help think through at least this one part of this puzzle. And as I said, in Karnataka, for instance, this notion of having long-term visibility, or at least a medium-term visibility of what is the policy going to be over the next few years, that's how it will help sort of investors figure out, should we make a 3-year investment, should we make a 5-year investment, and not say, okay, we make this investment, but then 6 months later, the contracts are being renegotiated. But today's situation is a bit sort of up in the air. The Electricity Act continues to hold, continues to say that open access and so on are the preferred routes. There was discussion some time ago, there was discussion of separating carriage and content. But today, all those conversations seem to have taken the back seat. You are seeing states now sort of step out to try and protect their utilities. And like I said, these are genuine and valid issues and concerns. And we are going to need to, as a collective, think through what these transitions are. The Green Power Market Development Group, which is the initiative WRI and CII run together, has been sort of one such effort in this space. I'm going to stop here and now open this up for questions. As I understand, there is as was introduced initially, you're requested to sort of type in your questions and send it to us. We will then pick them up and try and answer them. Thank you. right. All right, I can see. All right. There's one question on converting solid waste to pellets, to gas, and to electricity. These might be environment friendly, and economic as well, but implementation seems to be tough. I don't really have any particular knowledge of this technology, but I'm going to take your word for it that there are many new and emerging technologies that might have a role to play in our clean energy future. And I think that is part of the reason why at the highest level the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change has this a technology sort of appraisal committee that looks at some of these new technologies from the context of not just how feasible they are, but how economic they are. And I would encourage you, sir, since you say that you've been studying these technologies, to perhaps you could send it to them or send it to us. We can also forward it if you would like. But the idea is that I don't think this is going to be, and the point I was trying to make is that it's not just a technology fix anymore. We are looking at several new technologies that are very attractive. The economics need to be worked out. OP talked about electric vehicles, electric mobility. There's a lot of work that would still need to be done in order to understand how that's going to get implemented over what time frame and so on. I think the first step, of course, is in defining the destination, and then the next bit is when we figure out the journey that we will have to take. And so I hope, I don't have a more detailed answer to give you. How do we achieve the rooftop target 40 gigawatts by 2022 set by the government? Thanks for this. In the interest of keeping this focus, I didn't talk about rooftop, but you're right. It is one of the technologies that seems very obvious in terms of just getting it done. I think the challenge really has been that while we've looked at the finance side, we've looked at the technical side, what we've not yet understood really is the consumer side. The assumption with the solar rooftop has been that a subsidy regime would work, and so like in many other cases, the first thing the government did was offer the subsidy. Now it had some uptake, but clearly nowhere near what was needed, and plus given delays and actually developers being able to obtain that subsidy or consumers being able to apply for that subsidy, that wasn't as successful as we thought. And so the next thing we decided to do was offer net metering, and basically offer an incentive, a rate that allowed you to get paid for any additional power that you weren't consuming on your rooftop, but you were able to sell back to the utility. Now, that in pretty much most states in India have these net metering policies. Regulators have allowed this, but again, when you come down to implementation, utilities aren't very happy with this. Net metering, how much should you allow? Should it be based on your contracted load? What is the incentive you should provide? And should you actually provide an incentive? There are many people who feel that even providing an incentive is not necessary. And like I said, this is it's easy to find an answer to this when you take just one perspective, but this sector, given that we're now looking at such a sort of networked and complex set of perspectives, we're going to need to think through what's the right amount of incentive, what are the operational and technical challenges to overcome, and how do you ensure that the utility doesn't lose out from the rooftop solar target. Now, what you have seen is where it makes business sense. For instance, for hospitals or universities and colleges and sort of large campuses, they've not waited for anything. They've not waited for subsidies. They've not waited for. They've just gone ahead and done it because it just makes sense. And many consumers, sort of arguably some of the wealthier residential consumers have also, provided you have an adequate rooftop, just gone ahead and put this up. I think what we are going to need is to think about some of these newer business models that are out there. We just heard the secretary of the MNRE last week talk about the rent-a-roof scheme that they're considering. So these, and I think we're going to have to think, beyond our conventional mechanisms of subsidies and so on, and look at some of these business practices. One last point is that we also need to understand, get a better handle on the consumer perspective, because we've just assumed that the technology is there, people will just go in and install it. But many consumers do not know rooftop solar, what it's about, how it's going to work, whether these costs are going to pay back or not pay back. There's just a lot of informational challenges that we haven't gotten over. So I think that's also one of the sort of key barriers today that we're going to have to overcome. But the rooftop solar is going to be a very crucial part of how we are going to achieve our climate goals.
Let me, if I can just add a bit to this.
Sure.
This whole concept of a subsidy being given to make something successful would work well if that subsidy is a limited time subsidy. It's usually something that you use as an instrument to start something new, but at the end of the day, there has to be a business model that will make it work. And as Bharat said, this is really kickstarting the whole process. But then as we go further, there really has to be a business model that drives it in the longer term.
There's a question on are there successful initiatives on EVs in India? Are the current initiatives on EVs in India successful? If yes, why have we not seen a surge?
Let me try and answer that. Well, in India, the big thing that I see is we are talking about EVs. EVs in India, initiatives had started long ago, even way back in the early 2000s, when Scooters India and some other companies came up with electric vehicles. But these were small in number, and I think the larger ecosystem to make EVs successful hadn't really picked up. Today, I'm seeing a lot of conversation around EVs. A lot of senior level people in the ministries are driving the EV discussion. But what probably needs to happen, or rather what I think needs to happen, is it needs to move from talk to how do we make it happen on the ground. So you could have EV production, but if you don't have a good charging system in place, people are not going to buy the EVs. Now, anyone who's going to buy an EV is going to say, okay, I may buy this, but where do I charge it? There are concerns today about how far can I drive in my electric vehicle. There are concerns that you can't drive it for more than 100 and odd kilometers in a day or on a single charge. So that is something that's worrying people. That needs a kind of a campaign to say that, well, 160 kilometers is not what you drive in a day. You take several days to cover that distance. And that this is the kind of charging infrastructure that is already in place. So a lot of things really need to come together. And that is where I think a systematic roadmap on how do we move ahead with EVs needs to come into place. That's one of the exercises we are taking up in WRI on making EVs successful, roadmap for this.
There's another question on what steps the federal and state governments are taking to facilitate adoption of sustainable transportation.
Now, when you talk about sustainable transportation, there are, as I mentioned in my presentations, a very strong emphasis on public transport. Now, in 1990s, or rather in 2006, the government came up with a national urban transport policy. The key message in the urban transport policy is don't widen your roads, but emphasize public transport, invest in public transport. Fortunately, that was picked up in many cities, and many cities have gone in for large investments in public transport. But what we've seen is it's a large investment in high-cost rail-based systems, which cost a lot of money. What was not recognized is that these as standalone systems don't really serve a meaningful purpose. Unless the city is like Bombay, where a city has completely grown around a rail-based system, you don't get the kind of ridership that justifies this. So very recently, a few months ago, the ministry has launched another policy, which is called the Metro Rail Policy. The primary message of the Metro Rail Policy is not just about doing a metro, but doing so many other things around the metro that makes the metro successful. And I, for one, think that that's been a very good initiative of the ministry. And there may be challenges in implementation. How do you do a whole lot of other things around the metro that makes it successful? We'll need a lot of guidance, we'll need a lot of support, but I think that is really the direction to take. The other thing about sustainable transport, I think there's whole new forms of transport that are becoming available. You have the Uber pools and the aggregated shuttle services. To my mind, these are good initiatives. The problem that some of them is facing is that regulation has not caught up with this kind of a market demand. And we will have to look at what our regulatory systems, including the Motor Vehicles Act and others, how they encourage the entry of these kinds of new models. To my mind, this is what the market is asking for, and regulation needs to catch up with the market demand. So these are some of the things that I think would help promote sustainable mobility.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions, but OP, there's a question on the impact of EVs on the oil economy, and whether there are implications. Maybe you can think about it. I'll just respond to two questions. One was on short-term PPAs, and can commercial industrial consumers do short-term PPAs less than 5 years, because normally renewable energy companies prefer to do longer term. Now, the answer is yes, they can, and they have been doing short-term PPAs. We are going to see shorter-term PPAs, maybe even 3 years and less. There's a recent effort to try and look at the implications of the short-term PPAs and so on, because and really it's as you can imagine, some of the larger commercial industrial consumers have pretty much been able to dictate terms to the renewable energy companies. So they have been able to achieve this. But is it the norm? No, because again, it comes down to balancing and sharing of risks. But yes, there is now an increased effort to look at what the implications of shorter-term PPAs are, and how that might work. The other question was on the energy access and the off-grid space. And again, I didn't talk about energy access at all. But India has to address energy access, the energy access challenge with a similar, if not even more rapidly. I think the person who asked the question, I think, has also answered the question that it is not going to be easy for the government to admit that we're going to need a separate sort of comprehensive off-grid policy. The preference has always been to provide grid connection to everyone for various sort of political, social reasons. But that said, I think there is no sort of, well, first is that the draft mini grid policy the fact that some states have sort of come forward with mini grid policies and so on, suggests that there's at least that space to begin to talk about it. But I think really at the base of it, what we have to deal with is this assumption that that only grid is that grid supply is a superior product and everything else is an inferior product. And so we're going to need to address this difference of what these products are, and it is going to require. Now, does it need a comprehensive off-grid policy in order to do it, or is it something that needs some other effort? I think there are different strategies, but yes, it is something that we will have to do. The grid is not going to be able to go to every part of the country, and I think that is something that the government also recognizes. Do you want to take that oil economy or anything else?
Oil economy, well, let's face it, electric vehicles will certainly affect the oil economy. But then it's a very, very gradual effect that it will have. I cannot visualize a situation by which electric mobility will become the order of the day on all sectors. You may have urban sector which will pick up electric mobility a little more, but longer distances will certainly take a lot more time. The airline industry can't move to electric as of now. I can't imagine shipping moving to electric as of now. So it will certainly have an effect, but I think the impact will be much slower. And let's also remember that oil resources are limited. So the world needs to start thinking of alternative resources before oil runs out. So to that extent, I think it's the right direction to take. The oil industry itself will have to start thinking of how they can diversify more into electric. A lot of the automobile manufacturers have started taking up electric vehicles, recognizing this trend of the future.
All right, we have 5 minutes, so we'll try. Thank you for these questions. We will, these several of them, I'm going to need more time to respond. But there's a question on the recent MOP open access discussion paper, and the question seems to suggest that at the end that the charges, the open access charges, will end up being higher. And I think clearly the MOP paper has seen this from the perspective of how open access as being used as a route by consumers is impacting the utilities' finances. So when you see it from that perspective, and when you see the purpose of the Uday scheme, which is really to help utilities get out of the red and get back to some level of being financially able to run their business, then yes, it's clearly that you're going to have to first bring the utilities, help the utilities not lose any more money. But as I said, if you take one perspective, you will come up with one sort of policy initiative, and that is not necessarily going to take us into the direction that we are going to need to do. And so my point was that we need to go beyond these individual perspectives. How do you deal with an Uday scheme plus renewable energy targets plus consumers that want to take on more clean energy plus jobs in the sector? How do you, so it is really about being able to look at these together and finding solutions. I don't think, we really don't have any country or any state, any city that we can look at and say, they figured it out and we have to, just copy them. The clean energy transition is difficult, it is new, and every country in the world has to figure out its way to get there. It's not going to be linear. It's unlikely to have silver bullet answers. And I think the point is that just like these questions have picked at different. All of these are important. There's a whole set of questions people have asked around energy storage and how important that is, or the role that hydro can play, both as a supply but also as a potential storage and so on. And each of these, have a set of pros and have a set of cons. That need to be addressed and need to be addressed in a sort of collective manner. And the reason I sort of ended with talking about the Green Power Market Development Initiative was really to say that that's the kind of collaborated thinking that we're going to need, getting all the stakeholders around the table, regulators, utilities, private sector, consumers, finance, to actually think through what the solutions are, not just for the short term, but also for the long term. OP, do you any? There was one. I mean, there was a sort of 3-4 questions on. You're saying EVs, but the electricity sector itself is so coal dependent. So, is it really helping? What's the sort of oil versus coal? Is it that much of a difference?
Actually, EV, when you look at electric vehicles, there are multiple dimensions one has to look at it from. One is whether you're providing clean transport. Now, the clean transport will depend on how much of renewable energy is coming. So, success of renewable energies will really make clean transport through electric vehicles the right option. But you're also looking at electric vehicles from an energy dependency point of view. If we're going to depend on imported oil and the price of imported oil, that's yet another reason for which you want to look at electric vehicles from a non-renewable source dependency perspective. Yet third thing is that you're looking at very high levels of pollution in our cities. Now, the question that comes up is coal plants are also emitting pollution, but these are easier to control than you control millions of vehicles going around the streets. So controlling electric vehicle pollution from electric vehicles is probably easier than controlling pollution from these. So that's yet another argument for electric vehicles. Of course, the most important argument of clean mobility will depend on the success of renewable energy coming in a bigger way.
All right.
We've run out of time.
Thank you all for your participation. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to address all of them, but feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to continue this conversation.
Yeah, so to wind up this session, I thank you, Mr. O.P. Agarwal, CEO, WRI, and Mr. Bharat Jairaj, Director, Energy Program, for the presentation on the topic post-COP23, way forward for energy and transport sector. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take all the questions due to time constraints. If you have any other questions, please send them at editor@etenergyworld.com. It was an engaging and insightful talk, and hope all the participants have enjoyed the session. The recording of this webinar will be made available on etenergyworld.com. Thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.